This tutorial is part of a YouTube course playlist and a Udemy course. You can access the first phases of this course on YouTube or the whole course at Udemy. Links to both can be found in the video description. As part of our setup, we are going to implement Alembic. So Alembic is a lightweight database migration tool, typically utilized with SQL Alchemy. Alembic will provide all the tools to allow us to keep track of the changes to our database schema over time. So by using migrations, we can record the changes made to the database schema in a version-controlled manner. And this can make it easier to manage changes, roll back to previous versions if necessary, and collaborate with other developers. You will find documentation for Alembic in the docs commands folder. Inside of here, I will add the commands that we utilize in this tutorial and some additional commands that you might find helpful. The first task is to properly install Alembic. So pip install Alembic. Okay. And now we just need to update the requirements file. And now we can go ahead and initialize. So here we need to create a new folder. I'll create this folder called migrations. Now you can decide where you want the migrations folder to be. Inside of here will be the migrations. So when we create migrations, a record of that migration, which I'll explain shortly if you're not too familiar with that process, will appear all in here, as well as all the other Alembic configurations. So let's go ahead and actually run this. So you can see that inside of this folder now we have the versions folder. So inside of there, that's where the actual migration files will be placed. And you can see outside we have some setup files that we utilize. So this is the env.py file, which is essentially the configuration for Alembic. So we'll have a look at configuring that shortly. And in addition to that, you can see that there is an ini file also being created here in the root directory. Now we can move that file into the migrations folder if you want to keep everything in the same place. For the case of this project, we're just going to leave the ini file here in the root directory. So why would I want to use migrations? Well, let's imagine a scenario where we're not using migrations. What we haven't seen yet is that in our application, we're going to be creating code which is going to describe a table and fields that we want to build in the database. So we'll see that shortly in this course. So typically the setup at the moment is we'll use SQL Alchemy, which we have installed, to then go ahead and generate the SQL needed to actually build these tables and fields that we've described in our app in the actual database. So that's how a table can be made in the database. So we now have a table described here in our application, and we've now reflected that table utilizing SQL Alchemy, generating SQL code in our database. So throughout the lifecycle of our application, we want to keep an up-to-date record of all the tables and fields and relationships we have in our database within our application. Now, the problem here is that things change. Our application changes, scales, and grows, so we want to make changes to our data in our database. Now, one way we can do this, of course, is just to go into our database, make those changes, and then just make the changes in our application. So let's imagine we added a new field to our database, happy days, and then we need to make a new field within our app. Now, good practices would tell us that we need to obviously document that, make sure everyone is aware of that. That's all fantastic. So let's imagine we wanted to now kind of roll back this change, revert back to where we were originally. We would manually need to potentially go into the database, make that change, and then go into the application and make that change. That's all good and well, but using a migration system, we can automate much of this process. So utilizing a migration system such as Alembic, what can happen is that before we actually apply the changes to the database, we make a migration file. Okay, so this migration file is now created. In this migration file, it describes all the changes that we're going to make or will be making in the database. So it's like a version control system here. We're kind of keeping a record of all the changes that we've made. So we keep this, or we generate this migration file, and then we can follow the migration process as per normal. SQL Alchemy can then go ahead and generate the SQL, and make those changes in the database. But the added benefit of using a migration system is we are keeping a record of all the changes automatically. Imagine we wanted to roll back now. Imagine we wanted to revert back the changes that we made in our database. We now have a record of all the changes here. So we can just tell the system, actually, I just want to roll back to a previous state. For example, let's imagine we created 3 migrations. So for every single change we make in the database, a new migration file would be created. So we now have 3 migrations. We've made 3 changes. Let's imagine we wanted to revert back to, let's call this migration 1, 2, and 3. Let's imagine we wanted to revert back to migration 1. Well, we have a complete record here in the migration system, exactly how or what the state of the database was in this first migration. So we could just tell the system, well, in actual fact, we want to migrate back to migration 1. And it could then utilize this migration files or records to actually make the changes in the database and revert back to this version 1. Using a migration system is a great way of keeping track of the changes to the database schema over time. So the biggest benefit here of a database migration tool is its ability to track and manage changes to the database schema in a systematic and controlled manner. So going back to our implementation here, what we're going to find eventually is that we are going to be making a migration file that's going to be saved in this version folder here. That's where we're going to find the migration file shortly. So what we need to do is now integrate Alembic with our database. So we're going to need to tell it about our database, where to find the database connection. And in addition to that, it also needs to know about these models or these tables that we want to build. My first task is to just clean up this file. I'm just going to remove all the comments. I don't need them in this file. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And it's up to you whether you want to do that or not, but it just makes everything nice and tidy. And you can see everything all in one place. So I've removed that in the INI file. I'll do exactly the same for the in the migrations env file. Just going to remove all the comments. Right, so let's jump back into the Alembic INI file. So this is a configuration file used by Alembic. It's important we understand these basic settings here. So the script location. So this is the setting that specifies the directory where Alembic will store the migration scripts. And that's going to be, at the moment, in the migrations folder, of course. That's the folder we created. So inside of here, the migration scripts are going to be stored, in actual fact, in the version folder. So next up, we have the prepend. Right, so we know that the migrations folder is the folder that we're using here to store the migrations. Now, sometimes that might be stored somewhere else. So we can just define exactly where to find that. So at the moment, this file, this alembic.ini file, is in the root directory. So dot here just refers to the current folder that we are in. So that's where it's going to look then for the migrations folder. Now, of course, if we change the migrations folder, imagine we wanted to put the migrations folder in a subfolder. So that might be, for example, a subfolder called core. So we wanted to put the migrations folder inside of a folder called core. Then obviously we just prepend that so it knows exactly where to find the migrations folder. So in our setup, we're just going to keep it to dot, referring to the fact that we're going to find the migrations folder inside the current folder where the Alembic file is stored. So next up, we have the version path separator. So this setting specifies the separator to use in the migration versions directory names. So in this case, it's set to the separator provided by the operating system. So in this case, the operating system is providing that. So it's going to be a / or a / depending on the operating system. So ultimately, we've just defined the fact that to find the migrations folder, we're looking at the current directory where the INI file resides. And then here on the Mac, it's going to be / and then migrations. So that's simply what we've described there. So we have the current location, we have the separator, and then we have the folder name. And then last of all, we need to supply the database URL like we did with the database connection file. So in our project, we're actually going to set up multiple databases. So I'm going to create a separate section for the first database. I'm going to call this dev DB. These are the settings for our development database. In the next section, we'll go ahead and create a separate section for the test database, but for now, we'll just concentrate on the dev, not BD, the dev database. Right, so we have now the settings for our dev database. We can just leave the SQL Alchemy URL blank because we're going to supply that shortly in the env file. So let's remember, in actual fact, the URL that we're using is coming from the environment variable that we set here in the env file. So we want to use the same dev database setup, but of course we want to use environment variables for this. Now we could work out a way of utilizing the ini file for that, but it's probably going to be easier if we just create a record in the migrations env file. So in here, we can just override or just add that setting in. So let's modify below the if here. Let's go ahead and add to the config. So we've created the config, but at this point, it would utilize the configuration that we've set. In this case, it's for the dev DB. So at this point, we've got these settings. So we can then go ahead and override. So config, and we use the set section option. So we need to specify the settings that we're using, which is dev DB. Okay, that refers to our dev DB here in the ini file. And then we can define SQL Alchemy, what we want to update or override. That's going to be the SQL Alchemy dot URL. So that's what we want to update. Type that right, SQL Alchemy URL. Yep. And that needs to be in doubles. And then last of all, we can now define the environment variable. So os.environ.get. And let's go ahead and specify in this case, it's going to be the dev database URL. Now I need to import OS. So the only thing that we're missing now is the actual models, the actual data regarding the tables that we want to manage. So this is referenced here as the target metadata. So maybe what we can do is quickly build a model, and then we can just showcase the migration process. So we are going to be building tables. That's going to be found within the app. Let's create a new file called models.py. We will discuss more about building models, but let's just build something so that we can showcase this migration process. Now, the first thing is I'm going to change the DB connection to an underscore. Okay, so we can then import that in. So that's the first step. So let's go ahead and import from .db connections. Let's import base. So we're going to need this base to actually build a table. I'll describe more about that as and when we do that. So from SQL Alchemy, going to need a few tools. So let's go ahead and import a few tools to actually build some tables. So I need to be able to define columns in our table. So that's our records, that's fields in our table. And then we're going to define an integer field type. So let's bring that in. And now we can go ahead and build an actual table, if you like. So tables here are implemented, or models are implemented utilizing classes. So bring in a class. Let's call this category. It's going to be the category table. So bring in the base. So this is going to inherit all the tools that are needed to define the fact this is a table. We want to utilize this as a table so that SQL Alchemy can actually build this table that we're describing. So we give this a name, table name. We call this category. And then what we do is we just create a new field. So equals, this is going to be a new column. And then it's going to be a type. It's going to be an integer field. Integer field, yep. And then it's going to be a primary key. And then that should do it. So that's a basic table setup. So we can now utilize this hopefully to build a migration. Now, before we do this, let's remember that we are going to need to bring up our database if you haven't already done that. The command for that's going to be docker compose upd. So that's hopefully going to then start our docker compose file. So it's pulling down I've accidentally deleted the images, so I'm just having to download the images again. Yours might be a little bit quicker. Once that is done, you should find both images and containers are up and running. So let's just navigate into the Add Miner tool so that we can inspect the database and watch it be created. So that's going to be 127.001.80.80. And then the username and password is going to be Postgres. And the database is called inventory, I think. So the server, let's not forget the server, I think, is called devdb. So let's just bring that back. So it's devdb. Okay, so that's the login. So we have the inventory table at the moment. We don't have any tables. There are no tables. So let's go through the migration process. So here, to create an initial migration, we use the Alembic command, revision, and then auto-generate, and then we specify the name of the migration. Right, so let's give that a go. And it says here, no script location key found in the configuration. Because let's remember what happened here is that we've overridden the default settings. So Alembic by default is going to be looking for the settings described here in Alembic. So in actual fact, we're using the settings in devdb because we're going to have multiple database setups here. So we're going to be able to describe or define which setup we want to use. So in this case, we want to use the devdb setup. So for this, we run Alembic. So here we're initiating Alembic, obviously. We use the N flag, and then we can specify our, what is probably known as an engine. So that's going to be our devdb. Okay, that's our engine now described, if you like. And now we can go ahead and specify revision. So this command tells Alembic to create a new migration revision. In short, we're just telling Alembic to create a new migration file. So revision, and then we're going to need the auto generate. So this option instructs Alembic to automatically generate the migration script based upon any detected changes it's found in our database schema. And it should find our schemas because we've defined that. No, we haven't defined that yet, so it probably won't find it. But we will need to tell Alembic where to find our models shortly. And if it finds any changes, if it sees any changes, how does it know there's any changes? Well, first of all, if there isn't any migrations, it knows to have a look at our models and then make a migration based upon what's in the models. And then it can then use the migration file it's created to compare our models and the changes we've made in our models to the previous migration files that are created. And that way it can then determine whether any changes have been made. So we're going to specify auto generate. And then we can use the M flag, short for message, indicating that the following argument is going to be the name, if you like, of the migration. And that's going to be our initial migration. So that's a command that we're going to be using. So we try that. You can see here that it says the server running. It doesn't look like it's been able to actually create a connection to the database. More importantly, we need to tell Alembic about our target metadata, our models that we've generated. So let's move back into the env file first, in actual fact, before we fix this connection. And let's make sure we define our target metadata. So first of all, we need to say from app, let's go ahead and import models. Okay. And then the target metadata then will now equal models.base.metadata. Okay, so inside of our models, remember we're building models, but we're extending from base class. So we look in our models, we look for base, that will hold all the tables that are currently inside of this model where we're extending from base. And then this is the metadata about the tables that we want to generate. And that's the data that we need in order to actually create our migration file and then migrate and build it in the actual database. So now we've defined that, let's go ahead and try and migrate again. This time we have an error. It's a error type function. So it's likely that we have tried to, or we've forgotten to add parentheses somewhere. So we just need to follow this back to category base. So let's go back into the model here. Okay, category base. So we're importing base in, that looks absolutely fine. So we'll just trace that back. and base equals, okay, so we've forgotten to add the parentheses here at the end. So with that in mind, what we should have now is we should revert back now to the connection error. So we are still having a connection error. It looks like we're using port 5432. Of course, we're going to fail because we're not using 5432 port. Remember here, we are probably needing to send on the 5433, and that's being mapped over to port 5432 in the actual container, which is the port that the Postgres database is listening on. Now, the chances are that you are not experiencing this problem. Now, the problem I'm having here is that when I run the initial migration, it says failed, and it's looking for port 5432, but clearly we're using this dev database URL, which is trying to access correctly the database on 5433. Now, what I've done here in the env files, I've just gone ahead and I've hooked up the environment variable to a variable here, and I'm just going to print this out so we can see if I move up, in actual fact, what is actually being used, apologies, move up to top here, is 5432. So somewhere there is an issue. And that issue is related to the fact that the environment variable is not being assigned correctly to the dev database URL. So it's using potentially an older version of that. So remember, environment variables are stored on the operating system, and we can go ahead and view them. So here on the Mac, I would use, for example, print env, and that will show me all the environment variables on my machine. So if I use that command and just scroll down, I can see the dev database URL environment variable, and you can see that it's actually been set to 5432 and a different database due to me using it on different projects. So it's a little bit confusing how that isn't being overridden, but I will need to manually unset that so that I can then utilize dev database URL correctly. So I'll now go ahead and unset that. And hopefully now when I run the initial migration again, this time you can see it is run correctly. We now have the correct dev database URL environment variable set in the operating system. It is using now 5433. If I go into my migrations here, I should have now in versions my new migration. So this is a migration file. If we look down here, we can see what's happening. We're doing an upgrade here in the upgrade section. We're creating a new table. We're creating a new column in that table and defining a primary key constraint. That, of course, maps across nicely to our model. That's what we've defined here in our model's metadata. So the last thing to do is to upgrade. So remember we go back into the migration. Apologies, I came out. In the migrations, it has the upgrade function here and the downgrade. So it actually provides two functions, one actually how to build and one how to roll back. So if I needed to roll back, revert back to the default or revert back once I've actually migrated and made this change in the database, I can. It has the instructions here. So I just need to run Alembic upgrade head. So this is what I'm going to upgrade. I'm going to use this upgrade function to do or perform these functions here. So let's give that a go. And it says no script location key found in configuration. So what we need to remember here is that we're using the devdb configuration in the ini file. So we need to specify this. So in actual fact, we need to run Alembic, then the mflag devdb upgrade head. So if we give that a go, it looks like everything has now been migrated successfully. So now when we refresh Adminer, we find that our table has been migrated or created. So we have two tables here, the Alembic version. So this is going to record the migrations that have taken place so far. And then we also have, go back, if we also have then the category table. Of course, we only made one column. That was the ID column. It was the primary key. The primary key was the ID column. And there we have it, our first migration. Now, I do recommend documenting the commands that we're using specifically for this project. In the docs here, I do use generic names for the commands. So it's just going to make it easy for you to remember the actual commands you want to use. But obviously, you can utilize this documentation as a reference. Okay, so that's Alembic now integrated within our application. Apologies if that was a little bit long-winded. I did want to show you some of the common errors that I find students have when implementing Alembic. It is really simple. If you were to perform that operation again, that's going to take you a minute to actually implement within your application. Hopefully, it was valuable to go over some of those common errors and issues that you might have so that you're aware of how to fix them. because they are really small errors, but potentially they would take a long time to fix. You can't necessarily use ChatGPT or anything like that to fix these type of problems because they're not very common or well documented. So just to finish this up, I have deleted the migration file now. So we reverted back just to delete the migration file, and in the env file, so in the too many folders now, in the migrations env file, I have just reverted that back, line 14 here. Right, so in the next section, the test environment configuration, we will go ahead and add to this to create a separate configuration for the test database.